Imagine the world doesn't end with a bang. No mushroom cloud. No Hollywood soundtrack. It ends with silence. Not the silence of nature. The silence of movement. You step into a grocery store on a normal weekday. The fluorescent lights still hum. The cashiers still stand there. The checkout machines still beep. But the shelves look wrong. Not prices went up wrong. Not 2020 toilet paper wrong. Bare. No medicine. No batteries. No spare parts. No imported fruit. No cheap electronics. No animal feed. No fertilizer. The kind of emptiness that makes you realize your lifestyle wasn't built on money. It was built on motion. Then the second layer hits. It's not just food. Gas stations run dry. The power grid starts flickering not because your country ran out of engineers, but because the LNG tankers carrying the fuel are circling somewhere far away. Rerouted, delayed, or simply too expensive to insure. Factories stop not because workers went on strike, but because one missing component, one tiny chip, one valve, one specialized bearing, didn't arrive. And suddenly you understand the most uncomfortable truth of the modern world. The global economy isn't digital. It's physical. Wet, salty, rusty, and fragile. 90% of everything you touch, your phone, your clothes, your car, the packaging your food comes in arrived on a ship, not metaphorically, literally. And that entire bloodstream of civilization flows through a handful of narrow, politically volatile bottlenecks. Choke points. If one closes, prices spike. Too close, the efficient system begins to choke. If enough close, the world doesn't crash. It starves. And right now, geopolitical sharks are circling every single one. Welcome to the choke point crisis. But before we start building bunkers and hoarding canned beans, you need to understand the creature we built. Because this system wasn't engineered for resilience. It was engineered for profit, for speed, for ruthless efficiencies so optimized that it now behaves like a race car with no brakes. We suffer from a strange modern condition, sea blindness. We stand on shore, look at the horizon, and assume the ocean is empty space, a blue nothingness. But if you could see the ocean the way logistics companies see it through the heat maps of GPS pings, the water isn't empty. It's a highway. A jammed, global freeway moving roughly 11 billion tons of goods a year in industrial leviathan, quietly pushing something like tens of sermo, all trillions of dollars of trade value through the world's ports, canals, and straits. This is the real internet, not cables, containers, and like the internet, it has nodes. And like the internet, it has failure points. To understand why we're suddenly so close to collapse, you have to understand one invention, the box. Before the box, shipping was slow, artisanal chaos. Loading a vessel was like playing a high-stakes game of Tetris with sacks, barrels, crates. Everything shaped differently. Everything handled manually. Everything stolen if you blinked. It took days or weeks. And that friction distance, delay, cost was the natural defense system that kept supply chains local. Then, in the mid-20th century, a brutally simple idea arrived. Don't move the goods. Move the entire standardized unit. A sealed container that could jump from truck to ship to train without being opened. That container didn't just make shipping cheaper, it made distance irrelevant. It collapsed geography. It turned oceans from barriers into corridors. It turned a TV shipped across the planet from a luxury into an afterthought. And once shipping became reliable, corporate strategy mutated into something that looked smart. Until it didn't. Just time. JIT is the philosophy that inventory is waste. Why store parts in a warehouse when you can have them arrive at the factory door hours before they're needed? It cleans up balance sheets. It frees capital. Investors love it. Executives get promoted for it. But JIT is not a strategy. It's a prayer. It assumes the sea is peaceful. It assumes politics are stable. It assumes nothing ever goes wrong. And the moment you build your civilization on perfect timing, you guarantee that when timing fails, the failure is catastrophic. Because in logistics, what accountants call fat is what engineers call buffer. Buffer is survival. We spent decades stripping buffers out of the global economy, the way a bodybuilder strips water before a show, everything tight. Efficient, optimized, till the system became beautiful. and brittle. Then we scaled the ships themselves into monsters to maximize economies of scale. Shipping companies built mega vessels that carry 20,000 containers at a time, floating cities longer than skyscrapers laid sideways. It's Costco logic on the open sea. More volume per voyage means lower fuel cost per container. But consolidation concentrates risk. A world carried by 10 medium ships is a world with 10 points of failure. A world carried by one behemoth is a world where one problem becomes everyone's problem. When that behemoth breaks down, gets hijacked, or wedges itself into the wrong place, the impact is not local, it's global. And here's the final twist, the one that makes the whole system feel like a cruel joke. The ocean covers 70% of the planet. You'd think ships have endless room. They don't, because trade follows the cheapest routes. Currents, fuel costs, time schedules, port infrastructure, everything forces ships into narrow corridors, like arteries. And those arteries pinch into choke points. The Suez Canal, Panama Canal, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, Strait of Malacca. Imagine the entire blood supply of a human body forced through a drinking straw. That is modern civilization. And right now, someone is pinching the straw. In the next section, we're going to start our tour of the world's most dangerous corridors, where the threats aren't abstract, and the weapon isn't always a navy. Sometimes it's a drone. Sometimes it's a drought. Sometimes it's a line of code. And we begin at a narrow passage whose name is not poetic. It's a warning. The Gate of Tears. Look at the map of the Middle East and you'll see it. A tiny pinch at the southern mouth of the Red Sea, where Yemen stares across a narrow stretch of water at Djibouti and Eritrea. This is Bab el-Mandeb. In Arabic, it means the Gate of Tears. Historically, sailors cried there because the reefs and currents could wreck wooden ships and swallow crews whole. In 2026, the tears come from a different place. Insurance offices, boardrooms, ports, supermarket aisles. Because the Gate of Tears has become the most active live-fire experiment in modern economic warfare. And the experiment is proving something that terrifies every naval strategist on Earth. You don't need a navy to strangle global trade anymore. You just need a cheap drone. And a cause. For decades, the West lived under a comforting assumption that disrupting global shipping required serious hardware. Destroyers, submarines, aircraft carriers. This was the logic of the 20th century steel fleets. Blue water power, big guns, big budgets. And because the U.S. Navy has been the guarantor of freedom of navigation since World War II, because it had more tonnage, more reach, more firepower than everyone else combined, we acted like the system was protected by default. But history has a habit of humiliating arrogance. Since late 2023, the Houthi movement in Yemen has been launching missiles and drones at commercial vessels passing through Bab el-Mandeb. They frame it as political solidarity. The motivations can be debated endlessly. The economic reality cannot. A non-state act-ran organization that does not even represent a recognized nation-state in the traditional sense has turned the world's supply chain into a hostage negotiation. Because here's the ugly geometry too. Reach the Suez Canal, the shortcut between Asia and Europe. You must pass through the Gate of Tears. And through this narrow corridor flows a ridiculous share of the world's bloodstream. Roughly 12% of global trade and an even heavier slice of container traffic. It's not just stuff. It's the stuff behind the stuff: inputs, components, chemicals, machine parts, the invisible scaffolding holding modern life up. So when missiles started flying, shipping executives didn't take a moral stance. They did what capitalism always does. They did the math, and the math wasn't about politics. It was about risk pricing. Normally, insuring a ship is routine, boring paperwork, a tiny fraction of its value. But when rockets and drones enter the equation, the insurance market transforms. Premiums don't rise gently. They spike like fear. War risk premiums for Red Sea transits surged by orders of magnitude. And the moment insurance becomes too expensive, war too uncertain, the ship might as well be underwater already. Because in modern trade, the real weapon isn't the missile. It's the insurance contract. No insurance means no financing. No financing means no cargo. No cargo means no voyage. So captains turn the wheel. Instead of threading the Red Sea needle and crossing Suez, ships started rerouting around the southern tip of Africa, Cape of Good Hope, a detour of roughly 3,500 nautical miles that adds 10 to 14 days to a voyage. At first glance, you might shrug. Okay, so my package arrives later. But that's not the real cost. The real cost is systemic. Because shipping isn't just boats floating, it schedules weekly loops. Port slots, crane reservations, rail bookings, warehouse timing. A megaship is not a free agent. It's a moving appointment book. Every delay ripples forward like a chain reaction. When a ship takes 2 extra weeks to complete a route, that ship is effectively removed from the global supply pool for 2 extra weeks. It's tied up, locked in transit. Not available to carry anything else. To keep the same weekly service frequency, shipping lines must add more ships. But the number of ships isn't infinite. So the detour creates an artificial shortage of vessels, which drives up rates. This is how a drone fired from Yemen ends up in the price of your sneakers in Europe. Spot container rates from Asia to Europe surged. It's not because people suddenly became greedy, but because capacity became scarce not in absolute terms, but scarce relative to a system that had stripped out all buffers. And then there's fuel. A megavessel taking the long way burns obscene amounts of extra fuel, often well into the millions of dollars per voyage, depending on ship class, speed, and bunker prices. That cost isn't absorbed by the shipping company out of kindness. It's passed down the chain. Shipping surcharges gives importer costs, gives retailer margins, gives your checkout receipt. In rich countries, it becomes inflation. In poor countries, it becomes hunger. And now we arrive at the part that should make your brain itch, the part that reveals why this is asymmetric warfare at its purest. The Houthi fire drones that can cost tens of thousands of dollars. The response, often led by U.S. and allied naval force, requires interceptors that can cost millions of dollars per shot. This is not war in the old sense. It's economic bleeding. It's forcing a global superpower to spend Ferrari money to smash go-karts. And the go-karts keep coming. That's why this crisis feels different. It's not about one spectacular event. It's about an ongoing tax on the system, a constant, grinding friction that turns efficiency into vulnerability. And here's the deeper mechanism you need to understand. Global shipping is not protected by strength alone. It is protected by predictability. The moment unpredictability becomes normal, the entire model recalibrates. Routes shift. Inventory policies change. Factories reconsider where they build. Investors demand a premium for uncertainty. This is how a choke point becomes a lever that moves the world. Bab el-Mandeb is the demonstration, the proof of concept. But it's only the first stop on our disaster tour. Because if the Gate of Tears is a headache, the next choke point is a heart attack. Up the map, inside the Persian Gulf, there is a narrow lane of water that functions like an energy suicide button. The Strait of Hormuz. And the terrifying thing about Hormuz is that there is no detour. If Bab el-Mandeb is a bleeding wound, the Strait of Hormuz is the jugular. Follow the coastline north from Yemen, curve around the Arabian Peninsula, and you arrive at a narrow stretch of water between Iran on one side and the United Arab Emirates and Oman on the other. At its tightest navigational point, the shipping lanes are roughly 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles. Through that corridor flows the modern industrial world. Roughly 1/5 to 1/4 of global oil consumption moves through Hormuz every single day. Add to that around 20% of global liquefied natural gas, most of it from Qatar. This isn't marginal trade. This isn't consumer electronics or sneakers. This is energy. The fuel that keeps factories running, the gas that heats homes, the feedstock that becomes plastics, fertilizer, jet fuel. Oil is not just gasoline, it's chemistry. It is agriculture. It is logistics. It is geopolitics liquefied. If Bab el-Mandeb closes, ships can detour around Africa. Painful, expensive, but possible. If Hormuz closes, there's no alternative route. The oil is trapped inside the Gulf like blood behind a clot. This is why analysts sometimes call Hormuz the energy suicide button, because any serious disruption would detonate instantly across global markets. Oil prices wouldn't rise gradually. They would spike vertically. Futures markets would seize. Energy-dependent economies would convulse. And here is where nuance matters. Iran has threatened to close the strait multiple times over the past decades. It has harassed tankers, seized ships, conducted naval exercises, laid mines. The tension is not theoretical, it's chronic. So why hasn't it happened? Because of a concept older than nuclear weapons, but equally chilling: mutually assured economic destruction. If Iran attempts a full closure, oil prices could shoot toward levels that would tip the global economy into recession or worse. But here's the part often missing from headlines. China. China is one of the largest importers of Gulf energy. A significant share of Iran's oil exports from routed through gray channels to bypass sanctions ultimately ends up feeding Chinese refineries. If Iran fully closes Hormuz, it doesn't just hurt Western economies, it strangles its own customers. The world today is not cleanly divided into enemies and allies. It is entangled. Supply chains, energy contracts, and financial flows overlap in uncomfortable ways. That interdependence is both stabilizing and destabilizing. Stabilizing because no one wants to burn down their own revenue. Destabilizing because accidents happen, and that is the true risk. Not necessarily a planned closure, but a miscalculation. Imagine a scenario. Regional tensions flare. A tanker is seized. A naval escort intervenes. Warning shots escalate into something heavier. A vessel sinks in the shipping lane. Insurance underwriters, already jittery, declare the strait a war zone. No insurance means no transit. And suddenly, the global oil market doesn't care about politics. It cares about supply. The United States produces large volumes of oil today, thanks to shale. But oil is priced globally. If prices spike in Dubai, they spike in Dallas. There is no isolation from a global commodity. In the 1970s, oil shocks rewrote economic history. Inflation surged. Recessions followed. Political realignments occurred. That was in a world less interconnected than today. Now layer modern debt levels, financial leverage, and just-in-time logistics on top of an energy shock. The fragility compounds. But let's shift continents. Because choke points are not only threatened by men with weapons, sometimes they are threatened by the weather. Welcome to the Panama Canal. If Hormuz is geopolitics at its most explosive, Panama is climate change at its most patient and, perhaps most unavoidable. The Panama Canal is an engineering miracle carved through Central America, saving ships from the brutal journey around Cape Horn. It is a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific, vital for U.S. East Coast trade, Asian exports, and American grain shipments. But here's the part most people miss. The Panama Canal doesn't run on seawater. It runs on freshwater. Every time a massive container ship transits the canal, it must be lifted about 85 feet above sea level through a series of locks. That lifting process consumes tens of millions of gallons of fresh water per ship. Drawn from Gaetan Lake, a vast artificial reservoir that also supplies drinking water to much of Panama. This creates a quiet conflict of interest. When rainfall drops, the canal doesn't just face inconvenience, it faces arithmetic. In 2023 and into 2024, Panama experienced a severe drought linked to El Niño. Water levels in Gatun Lake fell dramatically. The Canal Authority responded by reducing the number of daily transits. Ships didn't stop. They queued. And some waited weeks. Picture a line of vessels floating in tropical heat, each burning fuel, each costing operators tens of thousands of dollars per day in operating expenses. Some shipping companies reportedly paid millions of dollars in auction fees simply to jump the queue. The canal became a marketplace of desperation. Now, by late 2025, rainfall improved. Traffic stabilized. The immediate crisis eased. But the warning was clear. Climate models suggest that extreme weather, both droughts and floods, will grow more frequent. Panama is planning additional reservoirs, but these projects take years, require massive funding, and involve social consequences like land displacement. Until then, every dry season in Central America is a stress test. And unlike missiles, you cannot intercept a drought. You cannot sanction a lack of rain. You cannot escort a reservoir with a destroyer. Nature does not negotiate. The Panama Canal crisis exposed something uncomfortable. Choke points are not only political, they are environmental. The global supply chain depends on ecosystems functioning within historical norms. When those norms shift, the supply chain inherits the volatility. If Panama tightens, U.S. LNG exports to Asia face delays. Midwest grain shipments reroute. Asian electronics take longer to reach American consumers. Costs ripple outward. And remember our earlier discussion about just-in-time. Weather does not care about your balance sheet. We are watching multiple choke points strained simultaneously, one by asymmetric warfare, one by geopolitical rivalry, one by climate variability. But there is a corridor that dwarfs them all. A strait so central that military planners lose sleep over it. A stretch of water that carries a staggering share of global trade and sits directly in the middle of a superpower rivalry. The Strait of Malacca. And beyond it, the South China Sea. If Hormuz is a heart attack, Malacca is systemic collapse. If the Strait of Hormuz is the jugular, the Strait of Malacca is the aorta. Stretching between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, this narrow passage connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. It is one of the busiest maritime corridors on Earth. Roughly 40% of global trade moves through this corridor. A massive share of East Asia's energy imports, especially China's oil threads, this needle every day. If Suez blocks, Europe panics. If Hormuz blocks, energy markets explode. If Malacca blocks, the global system fractures. Because Malacca is not just a shipping lane, it is a strategic pressure point in the rivalry between the United States and China. Chinese strategists call it the Malacca dilemma. In the event of a major conflict, particularly over Taiwan, the U.S. Navy could theoretically choke Chinese energy supplies by disrupting traffic through Malacca. That vulnerability has haunted Beijing for years. China's response has been deliberate and visible. Artificial islands constructed across the South China Sea. Runways, radar systems, missile batteries, coral reefs transformed into militarized outposts. These are not symbolic projects. They are insurance policies. Forward operating positions meant to project control and complicate blockades. At the same time, the United States has strengthened regional alliances. Defense cooperation with the Philippines has deepened. Access agreements, joint patrols, forward deployments. Missile systems capable of targeting naval assets in contested waters. The world's two largest economies are positioning themselves along the world's busiest trade artery. It hasn't gone hot yet. Instead, we see gray zone pressure Coast Guard vessels ramming supply boats, water cannons blasting crews, ships shadowed by patrol craft. The tension simmers below the threshold of open war, but all it takes is a miscalculation, a collision, a fatality. A treaty obligation triggered. And if insurance underwriters decide the South China Sea is a war zone, container ships will not gamble on patriotism. They will halt. Factories in Shenzhen slow. Semiconductor shipments from Taiwan freeze. Japanese refineries strain. The ripple becomes a rupture. We are not talking about mild inflation. We are talking about decoupling and economic divorce between East and West. The Strait of Malacca is where geopolitics and logistics overlap in the most combustible way possible. It is not about pirates or drought. It is about superpowers with pride. And pride is harder to insure than cargo. But physical choke points are only half the story. There is another choke point, one that doesn't appear on a map. It has no reefs, no currents, no missiles. It's called the US dollar. About 80% of global trade is invoiced in dollars. Around 90% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. Oil contracts, shipping insurance, commodity trades, they are settled in the currency issued by one government. For decades, this arrangement was plumbing, neutral, functional. But in recent years, the dollar has been weaponized. When the United States sanctions a country, it doesn't just block American firms. It threatens to cut that country off from the dollar-based financial system entirely. Since nearly every major bank depends on access to U.S. clearing systems, compliance is not optional. This is the ultimate invisible choke point. A signature on a sanctions order can freeze cargo in port, block payment, halt trade without firing a shot. Financial warfare has become as consequential as naval warfare. But weaponizing the dollar has side effects. When Russia, Iran, and other sanctioned states are pushed out of the dollar system, they don't disappear. They adapt. They trade in yuan, in rubles, in gold. In shadow networks routed through intermediary jurisdictions, payment flows migrate away from Western oversight. The result is a bifurcated system. On one side, the dollar-dominated financial architecture. On the other, a patchwork of alternative settlement systems. And that fragmentation has a physical consequence. Enter the dark fleet. These are tankers that operate outside conventional oversight. Aging vessels purchased cheaply, often nearing the end of their safe operational lifespan. Their ownership structures are opaque, their insurance questionable. Their transponders switched off or manipulated. They move sanctioned oil. They engage in ship-to-ship transfers in remote waters. They repaint hulls, change names, reflag under obscure registries. In just a few years, the number of such vessels has ballooned dramatically. A meaningful percentage of global tanker capacity now operates in this shadow ecosystem. Why does this matter? Because legitimate shipping relies on robust insurance regimes. If a modern tanker spills oil, established insurers absorb billions in cleanup costs. But if a shadow tanker ruptures, there may be no credible insurer, no deep-pocketed underwriter. Cleanup costs fall on governments and ecosystems suffer irreparable damage. We have already seen near misses in busy waterways, aging vessels colliding in congested seas. It is statistically inevitable that one of these rusting giants will break apart in a sensitive zone. The dark fleet is the unintended byproduct of financial sanctions and geopolitical rivalry. We pushed certain actors out of the system, so they built a parallel one, less safe, less transparent, more volatile, physical choke points, financial choke points, shadow fleets. And yet, there is one more vulnerability, arguably the most modern of all. Ports themselves. Because in 2026, cranes don't just lift containers, they run on code. Code can be hacked. In the next section, we move from missiles and tankers to servers and malware. The digital choke point. The silent blockade. We've talked about missiles. We've talked about straits and canals. We've talked about oil tankers and shadow fleets. Now let's talk about something more fragile than steel: software. Modern ports are not docks filled with men in overalls hauling crates by hand. They are automated ecosystems, robotic cranes guided by algorithms, truck gates controlled by centralized booking systems, customs documentation stored in cloud servers, container tracking coordinated by satellite data and logistics platforms. The global maritime system no longer runs on muscle. It runs on code. And if it runs on code, it can be hacked. This is the digital choke point. In 2017, a cyber attack known as NotPetya initially aimed at Ukrainian systems spilled outward and hit Maersk, the largest shipping company on Earth. It wasn't even the intended target. Maersk's booking systems collapsed. Port terminals froze. Thousands of servers went dark. Trucks lined up outside terminals because automated gates refused to open. The company had to reinstall tens of thousands of computers and thousands of servers in days. The estimated cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was an accident. Imagine a deliberate strike. In the early 2020s, ransomware attacks shut down major ports in Australia and Japan. The goal wasn't to steal data. It was to lock systems and demand payment. The cranes didn't break physically, they were digitally paralyzed. Ransomware is small time compared to what intelligence agencies warn about. State-sponsored actors have been identified probing critical infrastructure: ports, pipelines, water systems, energy grids, not stealing credit cards, prepositioning, planting dormant code that can be activated during a crisis. Imagine this scenario. Geopolitical tensions escalate over Taiwan. No missiles fly at first. Instead, malware activates. Container terminals in Los Angeles and Long Beach freeze. Booking systems crash. Port cranes stop moving. The United States doesn't lose ships. It loses logistics. The U.S. military relies on civilian ports for deployment capacity. The economy relies on synchronized supply flows. A digital shutdown would not be cinematic, but it would be devastating. This is the silent blockade. No Navy required. No mines in the water. Just corrupted code. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Cybersecurity is a perpetual arms race. Offense often innovates faster than defense. The complexity of global logistics software creates endless vulnerabilities. The choke point crisis is no longer purely geographical. It is computational. So let's zoom out. We have drones at Bab el-Mandeb, energy vulnerability at Hormuz, climate risk in Panama, superpower tension at Malacca, financial fragmentation via the dollar, shadow fleets operating outside regulation, cyber vulnerabilities embedded in ports. This is not a single crisis. It is a systemic condition, which brings us to the structural response already underway. The Great Rewiring. For 3 decades, the dominant logic was simple. Manufacture where it is cheapest, ship globally, keep prices low. That era peaked around the late 2010s. It began to fracture during the pandemic. And by the mid-2020s, the eulogy was being written. Corporations are diversifying supply chains, moving production closer to end markets, splitting manufacturing between China and secondary hubs Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Mexico, nearshoring, friendshoring, China +1. Mexico overtaking China as a top exporter to the United States is not symbolic, it is strategic. Moving goods by rail from Monterrey to Texas bypasses maritime choke points entirely. Resilience is replacing efficiency as the organizing principle. But resilience costs money. Building factories in higher-wage countries is expensive. Maintaining parallel supply chains is expensive. Holding extra inventory instead of running just-in-time systems ties up capital. The cost savings of hyperglobalization were partly built on 3 pillars: cheap labor, cheap energy, secure oceans. All 3 are under strain. This implies something uncomfortable. The era of structurally low inflation may be over. Consumers are paying a chaos premium embedded in goods, higher shipping insurance, diversified sourcing, redundant logistics. The world is reorganizing into regional blocks. North America integrating internally, Europe tightening its strategic autonomy, Eurasia experimenting with alternative systems. The ocean is no longer assumed to be neutral space. Geography is destiny again, and hard power is back. For 70 years, the U.S. Navy acted as the policeman of global trade. As attention shifts and resources stretch, maritime security becomes contested. More naval patrols, more convoy systems, more brinkmanship. The invisible hand of the market functions best when someone else ensures the sea lanes are open. Remove that guaranteed trade becomes risk. So what does this mean for you? First, diversification. If multinational corporations are hedging supply chains, individuals should hedge exposure, income streams, investments, geographic risk. Second, awareness. The stock market reflects yesterday. Shipping routes signal tomorrow. Watch water levels in Panama. Watch rhetoric in the South China Sea. Watch energy flows through Hormuz. Third, adaptation. The choke point crisis is not a temporary glitch. It is a transition from hyperglobalization to geoeconomic fragmentation. The world isn't ending. It reconfiguring. The arteries are narrowing. The flow is slowing. But human systems adapt under pressure. We built canals. We built megaships. We built global trade. We will build something new. But it will not be as cheap, and it will not be as naive. The question is not whether choke points exist. They always have. The question is whether we continue pretending they don't matter. Because when arteries clog, the body doesn't collapse instantly. It weakens. And in a fragile, leveraged global system, weakness spreads fast. The choke point crisis isn't about doom. It's about realism. The age of effortless abundance is over. The age of strategic logistics has begun. Stay curious. Stay prepared. And above all, understand the map. Because the next economic shock may not begin on Wall Street. It may begin in a narrow strip of water you've never seen.